Chapter 6 Undeep the Abyss. The manner of mock madness is one that does not abide by logic's right, and hence, when sober striding with deep breaths, Carl found his true calling was more than he thought that night. When the walking waned in his interest, he had planned with perfect precision his arrival at his automobile, with keys captured from cloth pocket in hand to swivel the tumbler on the door. These refined reverberations to mark his movements through the world would not suffice much longer. The thoughts, better rehearsed than any he spoke on stage, tied so strongly to his sense of his being that he knew while sober and experiencing the psychological and physiological high that followed his performances, that these markers in time, these vignettes of his volition used to escape the vapid nature of base and common occurrences, would not amuse his brain. His synapses, firing with the neurons of causal understanding, broached the chemical pocket that held his own existential awareness and lack thereof. Rather than delve into the staunch reality of true being and only being, he diverted his conscious attention to the section of his brain devoted to that joyful devotion known as love. If the music were not in the past, I could use it now to help me. At last! He arrived at his car feeling like it had taken him near forever to reach it. Boredom stood on its perch, watching him intently, its dark, leathery feathers rustling with a sickly scraping sound. "I'd need 2 stones to kill that bird," he said aloud, as he stepped into his car and took the driver's seat. He paused in his movement and wondered, with the door open, if anyone had heard him talk to himself just then, smiling with the thought that the reader may have understood that there was sense in what would be nonsensical to others not privy to his thoughts. He pulled the car door shut and started the engine. Not wanting to lose his focus and descend into an abyss of mechanical routine followed by that damned bird of boredom, and trying to stave off the desire he could feel to have a drink, he pulled from his spot with no specific destination in mind. Possibilities abounded, but none resounded to remain his intended goal to reach. Reading at home, tea at some shop, maybe live music. Of course! Live music capital, he heard himself preach. The internal processes and external expression were well honed into a total for Carl. His age, his experiences, his lessons learned from both, and his penchant for live performance all congealed together to form a well-harmonized culture of attributes that sometimes yielded more efficient function than forms of fun for him to enjoy. He drove and started to ponder what Mac had said about him, about the presence of something held back on stage. "Of course I hold it back," he said to verify that he was thinking these thoughts. "It is part of my human nature that would otherwise hold me back from performance. The apprehension, the loneliness, the feeling that it is all for naught." He liked that word. Naught, naught, naught. Naughty, 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 he babbled as he drove south, and was silent for a moment to experience his amusement over his tiny sachet into ridiculous phonetic incursions upon the air. That it may be for nothing, that every moment alive, all the experiences might very well be only so that they could be, and there is no greater cause, no higher reason or universal purpose for any of what we do, see, hear, know, experience. A chill ran along his back and up his neck, and he noticed the tears from before were back for another escape attempt. Even feel. The chill resonated throughout his head and chest, radiating to his appendages with the thought of his having spoken those words. To think that what we feel is for no reason other than being so we might feel. It's crushing. He suddenly was victimized by thoughts of his death, impending yet delayed as long as he could delay it. Carl was prone to moments of macabre thought on the matter. The eventuality of his own death was one of those truths that spurred him to move forward, to refuse to do any less than his best, and accept anything from the world other than what he wanted to see and know and love and be. The world would eventually go on without him, a harsh truth all must eventually accept of their fate. Mortality, that heathen stench of time rotted, littered the fields of inspiration with the helplessness and hopelessness that it cast from beneath its robe of woven despair. The mocking gesture of fruitless endeavors, captivating thoughts, repeated patterns of enjoyable emotion, convincing us that the solid marching forward to the inescapable cessation of ourselves, final and unflinching, is more than a fleeting set of experiences and distractions. So there is beauty, if distraction must be. I would not have anything less than the great fear, the unrelenting truth of my demise, be what gets me out there to be an active participant in the world. Because if I can't be around to see it forever, I will make such a noise, such an effort to beautify and improve the ways of the world, that there may forever be something, and something through which I can be always connected to the world. He found solace from his own crushing nihilism as he merged onto the southbound interstate road and was met with traffic so slow that his attention was forced onto it. As long as that world could be relatively free of traffic, he said, I would be all right staying connected to this world, even if not consciously. With traffic? Definitely not consciously. He found the musing slightly less humorous than he had anticipated just before he spoke it, and offered an apology of sorts to the reader. Grace to the reader be, he said with a giggle to himself that faded with his returning thoughts from before the traffic. Maybe the reader would be reason, or at least give hope that there is reason, and not New Age or spiritual reason, but something that relies on tangible perception. What was that thing Jason likes to mention? He drummed his fingers on his steering wheel. The singularity. He tucked his lips into his mouth to moisten them and started looking through the center console next to him for his tube of lip balm. Hey, baby, I'm singularity and ready to mingularity. He subdued a laugh that arose from his own amusement. Finding the tube and quickly applying the contents to his lips, and catching a quick glance at himself in his rear view mirror, he smiled, happy that he appeared so attractive to himself at that moment. The Mingularity sounds like some lasso weapon used by Flash Gordon's nemesis. The realization that such a reference would be lost on a great many younger people struck him. Oh, reader, I am so very old. He looked at himself in the rear view, giving more attention to the area surrounding his eyes, scrutinizing the skin for wrinkles while keeping a close eye on the flow of traffic and inching along steadily to the south. Carl did not care much for aging, but he did not care about it much either. And that distinction was very important to him. As much as he did not like the idea of eventually dying one day or night, he liked even less the notion that immortality could occur without retaining the vitality of youth. The vigor that he worked at maintaining was always just barely held and constantly threatened to slip from his grasp. He thought back while glancing back at the traffic building behind him and recalled his decision around his 18th birthday to actively pursue his desired form of physical fitness and the health therein. He took to the gym and began an exercise regimen that would be the center of his versatile life through his 20s and into his early 30s. He tried to glaze over his early 30s with a passing glance, but outcroppings of emotional turbulence, the remainder of those years he had spent in his failed marriage, slowed his passing, and he was forced to look into them longer than he would like. He saw the depressive cycle of codependent alcoholism he and his ex wife practiced, and the light drug use. The inability to connect sincerely with each other, and the long time spent arguing where each step one would take offended and angered the other. Provocations became plentiful, and money was always tight, not because they didn't work, but because of what was spent on the intoxicants. The entire marriage had been unhealthy, and nothing was a sign more clear to him than the memory of his having stopped working out during that time. He remembered the actual feelings of wanting death to come, drunkenly willing death to arrive to take him from there. It now was the stark reminder to him that drinking, even in the small controlled doses which he had been using over the past months, was not for him. His best interest lay in gaining back what he had let go during times when he felt lost. Lost in booze, in pot, in sex. The notion of getting lost in sex intrigued him because it had only happened maybe twice in his life. Perhaps a third is in there, but it was a fling undertaken at a Las Vegas hotel late one night when he had been hired to perform for a weekend. No alcohol involved, at least not on his end, but a loud and powerful night of passions plunged him into the frame of mind where he lost track of time, seeing the sun rise while wondering if it was after 3 a.m. yet. The lady who accompanied him on the journey left quickly and without word when he was in the shower. No note, no message, nothing from her as a memento, other than the night of carnal action. She left nothing and took nothing, a fact he checked thoroughly when he realized she had skedaddled. He wondered if she was married and using him, if she was a bride-to-be or maid of honor having a fling just before the wedding, and pondered the notion that she was just a young woman who wanted him, if only for the night. He touched his hand to his face and felt the stubble there, running his index finger and thumb down his cheeks to meet at the bottom of his chin. He smiled with the last memory and continued moving forward, the traffic loosening up its tight presence on the asphalt as the cars began moving faster. Still waters may run deep, but cosmic winds never cease, he said to himself, and turned on the radio, keeping his hand by the presets. He wondered how many other people did the similar switching through the stations that he tended to do. If others did, and he vowed to start asking other people if they did, he found a strange sense of uniqueness in believing that he could and readily did shut the radio off if he flipped through the preset stations to hear no song that tickled his fancy at that moment. The silence returned like a knife drenched in butter to the toast of his psyche, and spread all throughout the cracks and crevices of his mind. His ability to drive kept his attention on operating the car, and he found that he was able to ponder his own self with greater ease. With the movement, the deep nature of his being could not be fully fathomed, and that made for an appreciation of the contoured landscape of his soul that plumbing each valley would not have allowed him to do. Soul, he heard himself say, and likened the sound of the words to the essence of his very self that no one, perhaps even he himself, fully knew for its entire actuality. That was his counterbalance to the notion of the reader, that he himself did not care to detect himself as much as the reader, if existing, could. His self was made for motion, and the hindrances of sentimentality, nostalgia, even self-awareness could too easily become something negative for a person who regularly practiced them. The principle to which he tried to hold tight was one of non-attachment, primarily because he liked contradictions. Soul, he said again, this time with more willful awareness, so he could hear the rounded ringing of the word writhe through the air. A magnetism of his own imagination was pulling him towards a thought, and the notion that guided him was one of relentless anguish over the back and forth he felt between his desire to be and his desire to be more. To be content with who he was would be a form of complacency, but to have the discomfort with himself to perpetuate his continuing evolution of self would be to never truly be happy with who he is. His imagination granted him the reprieve of glimpsing a set of scales on which his values were weighed, and the total of the one could be compared with the total of the other, insomuch as they were differentiated. The clear vision in his mind, however, displayed a perfect balance, and he felt discouraged and invigorated, primarily because he really enjoyed contradictions and repetitions. He also enjoyed repetitions of sayings that can be related to multiple topics. To craft them is to alert the world to his presence, and to convey them is to garner a pat on his back from himself, figuratively, as he felt accomplished in doing something with his energy. Like working out for his brain, he could masterfully perform the CrossFit routines he practiced every other day to maintain his muscular physique. But unlike working out his body, the practice of routines and recitations he uses to maintain his mental acuity were not as obvious to the eyes of those around him. Soul, he said a third time, and could hear the ageless echo of his own soul in the word. Jason had seen Carl's silent recitations. At a time when they were watching a musical performance on a local stage, Jason noticed certain tells of the incantation, the prayer of sorts that Carl was running in his mind while watching the performance artists beatboxing while playing dueling flutes. Jason asked him about it, and Carl was impressed with his level of attention to detail to see something subtle as flexing the muscles surrounding his lips that he broke the recitation cycle to swing his head toward his friend and smile. The two had a much greater bond after that. They still knew very little about each other, but the flow of conversation came easier, and that gave Carl a great sense of power to know his subtle internal workings could be visible to another person, and that person was endeared greater to him because of what was seen. So maybe Jason is the reader, Carl mused, pulling off the interstate, 'cause he did read me fairly well. And then he thought about how he wished either of the girls would be able to give him such attention as to see what Jason had seen. And it was at that precise moment that a revelation of the highest order became clear to the 42-year-old comedian. The reader is important in having something that recognizes us in our entirety. But more important is finding those persons who see us in a way which we enjoy, partly because of who they are to us, and partly because of how they see us to be. In the following moment, the fleeting thought of how he was referring to himself as us was given less than his primary attention, owing to his thoughts about how he cherished, above all his other relationships, the odd connections he had to Tabitha, Jason, and Danny. He had known each for a different amount of time, but each felt like the same degree of friendship, although not identical in form. He had known Tabitha since before his divorce and spent a good portion of the 2 years following the final decree pursuing her romantically, going so far as to convince himself that he was one of the reasons she had made the full move from San Antonio to Austin, a thought not untrue, although she did it for reasons of inspiration and not with intimate intentions in mind. It was a strange connection in their relationship during that time. a symbiosis that forged the foundation of their friendship to be stronger than anything else either had tempered in relationships with others. While she was getting her footing in Austin, she spent many nights in his apartment, in his bed, where they would sleep next to each other, holding with all true intimacy their partner for the time. They did not venture into the realm of sexual intercourse, although they were so close that they discussed it with comfort. Spooning, cuddling, snuggling, they managed to provide a sense of the involvement each needed without going over the edge into physical sexuality. The one moment they found themselves together, both wounded emotionally for their own reasons and desiring more, they shared one kiss that merely was the prelude to comfortable sleep in each other's arms. When she signed the lease on her first apartment in town, he felt somewhat heartbroken. He had sensed that he always wanted them to be together more than she did, and the residual emotion from that desire carried away his heart for a moment in dreaming of what would have been if they had become a couple, been married to each other, had children. He sighed with a contented despair for what might have been, but was best to have not happened. If it had happened, he would not have met Jason and found an inspiration for word use that he had all but forgotten. 2 years after his divorce, he was mainly doing voiceover work for radio, selling tickets for 3 local theaters, and taking any acting gigs that he could get after lengthy and draining auditioning processes, when Tabitha began speaking of a poet who started showing up to the open mics she was hosting. His first inclination was to be jealous of the man of whom she spoke so highly, and he reluctantly attended to see him perform. His second and lasting reaction was one of awe. Jason was a fidgety mess of a person who only barely managed to complete sentences without stumbling over his words when Carl met him at the table in the bar. But once he took the stage, poised in the spotlight with no instrument save his voice and memory and ability to speak, Jason came alive with the passions of human artistry. His words spun fabric of rhyme and meter, churned tones into sweet, smooth cream that raised above the audience and doused them with notions and thoughts, images and metaphors, augmenting their reality to elevate their consciousness individually and collectively. Carl saw the transformation of the socially awkward, nervous mess that was Jason become virile and daring, an emotive human force of eternity echoing with the pulse of human love for all things, and he understood what he saw as being the beauty that Tabitha had described. Carl became inspired to not just perform, but to create his own material, and that began his journey toward stand-up comedy, a profession at which he had more than modest success. There was something more to Jason, though, and more to Carl's relationship to Jason than just awe and inspiration. The give and take was present in that Jason would mention certain aspects of Carl's self, or aspects of what Jason thought was Carl's self, and speak about them with Carl. At first, Carl was curious as to why Jason seemed so intrigued, but over time he realized that Jason was not just a little socially awkward, but very much so, bordering on inept in the realm of reading other persons. To that end, Carl understood that this young literary mind was asking Carl about things he thought he saw about Carl, and Carl would speak honestly with the intention of helping Jason fine tune his people reading skills. It was a relationship in which both were gaining something great at little expense to the other, and that was the kind of friendship, the kind of fraternal emotional attachment that Carl needed, and he knew on some intrinsic level that Jason needed too. And once the needs that were previously unknown were met, there was an eruption of creativity from Carl that changed his life in practice and in form, in outward expression and internal organization. When both of those levels of his persona were coming into near perfected alignment barely 2 years ago, Danny arrived in his life like an afterburner to propel him onward into the vast expanse of all good things. How could it be that he could cross paths with someone who was so intriguing and alluring, so incredibly seductive to his own mind and powerful in having insight to his vulnerabilities, and not wind up sleeping with her? It might have something to do with the fact that he was more than twice her age, or at least he was when they first met. He thought back to the Right Root Fire Show, the local pop jam band at the southern location of Stomping Grounds Lounge, when he met her. She was 19 years old and dancing to a Beatles cover enriched by the sound of a 12-string guitar and laid-back tone of performance as he was sitting at one of the tall tables entranced by her movements. He was uncertain if she had been there with a boyfriend, but he soon noticed that she seemed to be there with no one other than herself. And that was the first time he had seen a young lady with such self-assuredness as to go out to a place just to dance without any previous knowledge or plans to meet someone she knew there. And he told her that, to which she had said that he must have lived cloistered, sheltered from the brave forms of yin that will venture out just to locate the good time they want on their terms. Also, she had met the lead singer the night before, and he had gone so far as to promise her 2 free drinks if she came and danced. Admitting, with that giddy slur of light intoxication, that she was 19, she continued to dance until the song ended. Carl was intrigued and thought that she was an amazing sight to behold, and so he set upon trying to hold her, and so he went to talk with her and found her to be in that realm where she was dancing not to the music, but to the spirit that the music invoked. She was clearly not adept at holding her alcohol, and he decided to help her by getting her water, club soda, Sprite, and 2 coffees, and lining them up on the table in front of her as she sat down panting at the end of the next song. Over the course of the following 45 minutes, as she sipped the beverages, her voice became steady, her words became clear, and her personality shone through with the brilliance of quadrillion star galaxies. That was when Carl realized her sexual orientation and decided He would had rather have been born a female to have the opportunity to ignite the fires of passion for her as she did for him. In the unintentional goading of his libido, Danny found Carl to be honest and charming, yet with a dignified sense of passion's place in the scheme of life, that he could feel for her and express it in a way that would exonerate him from its gnawing presence in his thoughts, yet also in a manner that would not lead her to be uncomfortable with him and their talks. Their talks began on that night and extended into their lives in ways neither would have predicted. The immediate dramas of the 19-year-old were readily relayed to the 40-year-old for advice and insight, and both appreciated the respective reverence and attention of that relationship. Carl looks back on those 2 years as though they were yesterday, while Danny saw them as a tumultuous set of times past fettered with trials and tribulations. The coming of age that she was experiencing was well summarized by him one night, almost a full 2 years after they met. Eventually, you'll see, when you come across someone younger, how the same event that evokes slight concern from you can evoke immense concern from them. The meaning differs, and that is where you can find the solace of friendship as a great source of intimate connection. He remembered those words very well. It was one of those moments that he improvised in speaking and conjured something he was very proud to have voiced. It stood as an ideal that he was apt to believe he upheld, but he knew it to be something to which he clung to justify his constant defeat of his desire for Danny. As he pulled his car into the parking lot behind the venue that was his destination in this sojourn, he thought of himself with a clear idea as to who he was. Perhaps in thinking that a reader would be made aware of his total self, he was able to emulate that sort of awareness and read his own life as it was. The majesty of moments spent in vital embrace, the tides of bright skies and dark clouds, winds on skin and fires delights upon the senses, hypnotic and surreal, makes for the experience that is the total understanding of what one lives through. And the emotive reaction to each is what gives it meaning. Not the general beauty, not the timeless nature, but the experiential, in the moment, unrelenting, shallow, and sometimes trite reality that we know, think we know, hopefully love, and perhaps create willfully. If the reader were to hear the voices of instruments unplayed or those times of lovers well made for each other in the form of what is created, built for themselves, might the work be shelved? Would there be no better cause to live, and live in the heights of life with daring, uncouth, and sordid behavior, that it inspires the reader in one way or another to achieve a version or identical experience as depicted? Clearly, if the reader is still reading, then Carl was not living his life to the fullest. The door to the bar restaurant beckoned into the night with warmth and music to the ethers, whispering promise of universal solace and reprieve from that which ails the mind during the common activities of the days spent living and being. Karl brushed the dust from the stars shaking in the heavens from his mind, and let his fire of living guide his heart onward. Sober and uncertain in himself, clearly quaking with the divided sense of who he was and who he appeared to be, even to himself, his tears would be dry, his heart would be cold, and his love would be raw, unless he found reason to salve his self wounded and recognized as damaged by his own mind's eye for the first time in years. Sober and untold in his own times tortured, hurt, and finally left to see and feel and know the extent of his pains, Karl decided to cast his apprehensions aside and allow himself to be vulnerable.